And plan for today is to continue with the substance use. So let's go ahead and go back to where we were at the other day. And we were talking about opponent process, and I encouraged you all to kind of mull over this a little bit and see if you had any questions. So anybody have any questions about this before we get moving along today? Of how important understanding this is when it comes to understanding addiction. All right, we'll keep plugging along then. Last symptom in substance dependence is withdrawal. And again, it's that characteristic syndrome for that substance. And then a lot of times in the whole kind of loop, individuals end up using the same drug to relieve withdrawal symptoms and not have to go through that. And that's how people kind of get trapped in using over and over again. Substances are taken in larger amounts and over a longer period of time than was intended. And this is where it starts to eat up individuals' lives, their occupational lives, their home life. There is oftentimes a desire to want to cut down or to quit using. And if there are efforts, there are oftentimes unsuccessful efforts to do so. And again, that's where that physical dependency gets them. Lots and lots of time spent obtaining the drug, using it, recovering, a lot of loss of important social, job-related, recreational activities because of the extended time that the drug use is taking, and continuing to use despite knowledge of having problems, recurrent physical and psychological problems from the drug. And then we specify in the DSM, are we talking about a drug that has very powerful physiological dependency? So like the stimulant meds would be the case, the sedatives would be the case. Drugs like cannabis use, a lot less physical dependency going on there. It's usually more of a psychological dependency. For many individuals.
So substance dependence is more about the physical dependency?
It can, but it might not be. So kind of the point, the specifier down here, Alexis, is that's where, this is the place where you kind of comment on that.
Okay, gotcha.
So you can be, I mean, you can be addicted to cannabis. And you can be dependent on cannabis, but it's going to be a little more of a psychological dependency than a physical dependency. Now, having said that, I do want to comment on sleep, because a lot of people will regularly be dependent on cannabis in order to fall asleep. And in that case, that is more of a physiological dependency. But in general, cannabis is not nearly as powerfully physically dependent as, like, say, the stimulant meds are. Okay, let's talk a little bit about alcohol use, and particularly for college students, and then we're going to move over and talk about smoking. In a survey that was conducted a few years ago in college first year behavior, so this would be what we normally consider to be freshmen, most had drank beer, wine, or liquor being one of the more popular ones. Most had smoked marijuana. Most had used an illegal drug that was not marijuana. And I want to talk a little bit about Greek life. We know that individuals that are in social fraternities and social sororities tend to drink more than individuals who are non-Greek. And I'd like for y'all to speak to that. What do you think is going on there? Why would Greek college students be drinking more than non-Greek?
Well, from my observations, I've never been a part of Greek life and I don't know much about it, but just from my observations, it seems like a lot of their culture as groups is partying.
Yes. So that's a part of the social life, is the partying,
yeah,
and,
the social
and having alcohol accessible. I think you're right, Alexis. And we even know things like having cups for drinks. People drink more than they have bottles, and cups are usually buying it in bulk, like in a keg, is cheaper than buying it in a bottle. We know that if there is water available, students tend to drink less at parties if they can rehydrate. We know if there's food available, students tend to drink less and get less drunk at parties. And I feel like there's more to it. There's something else. Oh, I also want to comment on if you are a college student who already has a drinking problem, might you be able to hide out and feel more socially acceptable if you were a part of a sorority or a fraternity? So it can work both ways. A lot of times there's just, it's environmental and it's social, and there's much heavier drinking while in that organization. And then just about all college students who drink in college tend to drink a lot less once they graduate and get out into the real world. But I do want us to entertain the idea that if you've got a drinking problem, you look more normal if you become a part of an organization like that than, say, if you were drinking on your own or drinking in your apartment, that kind of thing. So it can work both ways. Consequences of drinking alcohol for college students: having a hangover is the most common. Having vomited is pretty frequent, and that can be really dangerous, particularly if somebody falls asleep and they're not in rescue position and they vomit, they can aspirate and die from that. Regretting actions, 40%, 33% getting in a fight, 30% missing class. Maybe that's where our missing classmates are. 29% being criticized, and this is scary, 36% report driving after drinking. I'm going to show you, let's do this. Let me stop share. I want to show you YouTube. Let me make sure I got it pulled up. Boop. Okay. Let me find you. Let me share. Gotta talk myself through this as I push the buttons. Okay, this is just for funsies.
The wood spider is the most accomplished of all web-building species. Recently, scientists gave these tiny creatures a variety of psychoactive drugs to observe their effects on web building. When given a minute dose of LSD, the spider's web took on an unfamiliar, minimalist structure. When given caffeine, the web structure was not affected, but the spider's behavior was. Given THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, the spider didn't build a web. It built a hammock, where it lay all day and watched the caffeine spider go. When given alcohol, the spider built a web, found a mate, and raised over 100 young. But the mate got a restraining order, and now the spider can't go within 100 centimeters of the web. The crack cocaine spider figured building webs was for suckers, waited till the caffeine spider was exhausted, then came up behind it and popped a cap in its ass. Nice web, Mr. Crack Spider. When winter came, the marijuana spider had no place to live. It ended up in the crack web as the crack spider's bitch. For more information on the crack spider's bitch.
Okay, that was just for fun. Okay, so those are consequences for college students. Oh, let's talk about expectancy effects. Somebody shout out, when you are drinking alcohol, what's one thing that you kind of expect to feel or expect in your behavior?
You act like you wouldn't act when you're sober.
Yeah, there's a disinhibition there that happens oftentimes. So maybe a little looser. Have you all heard the term social lubricant, which I think is a funny term, but social lubricant that helps you a lot of times be a little more talkative and a little more sociable, especially with the small talk stuff and the humor. What else? Sexually, what do we expect?
You can use alcohol as an excuse to hook up with people and not have to feel slut shamed or whatever.
Yeah, there's that would kind of be the outcome there. That's a good one. But then a lot of times people feel sexier on alcohol. So there's a little bit of that, and then the feeling sexier, and then sort of like more wanting it more. So a little bit more of an excuse for, like you said, the hooking up. Other effects. Can anybody else think of any others? The sexy one's interesting because that's kind of operating in the brain in a way where it's disinhibiting and it's making us feel a little more attractive, a little sexier. But physically, what's going on in the body, our bodies don't perform very well on alcohol. They perform better not on alcohol. So that's one of the places where the expectancy effect is actually in the opposite direction of what's reality and what's really happening. So in this research, what they did is they would survey individuals on what they expected, the emotions, the behavior, the physical effects when they were drinking alcohol. And then they randomly assigned these individuals to either get real alcohol or to get placebo alcohol. And the way they do placebo alcohol is they make gin and tonics, but the placebo is getting the tonic and usually the lime or the lemon. And then in the real alcohol, they're getting a true gin and tonic with gin, tonic, and lime or lemon. Okay. And that's the drink that's usually used because individuals in the taste of the drink, they really can't taste the alcohol, if that makes sense. They're really the tonic, the bitter of the tonic, and the citrus of the lime or lemon kind of overwhelm the taste. So does that make sense? So they don't know what they're getting. But the results, what's really interesting about it is that individuals who are getting the placebo drink that really doesn't have alcohol in it, but they think it's an alcoholic drink, whatever their expectancy effects are, tend to happen. Sometimes they don't happen nearly as dramatically, but they still happen anyways. So imagine you've got a drink that you think is an alcoholic drink and you're drinking it, and you usually get more talkative and more outgoing and more friendly, flirty, and all that kind of stuff. That's really going to happen to you. Questions here? Imagine what a cheap party you could throw by giving placebo drinks instead of the real drinks you offer. So much of what is happening, and again, the alcohol and the feeling sexy, what we expect and what's really happening in our bodies are two different things. Questions, comments? Okay, let's talk about the major types of treatments for addictions. And so this could apply to alcohol stuff. It could apply to drug stuff too. If individuals are physically dependent, they usually need to go through a medical detox, and that could be medically supervised. Usually this is in a hospital setting or a rehab setting. You got to get them physically clean first before they can do the real psychological work. Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, is not a professionally run, it's a self-run program. There are 12 steps in recovery that people work in a particular sequence. Usually they are hooked up with a sponsor, and everybody has a personal sponsor who is much further in their recovery than the newbie. It is a spiritual model, meaning that in part of the recovery and part of the steps, it's to get closer to God. And some people that they find that to be really, really helpful, and other individuals tend not to like AA because they might be atheist and they don't believe that that would be helpful. And in some situations, people don't want God shoved down their throat kind of thing. But for some individuals, that is really helpful. And some people find God in their recovery because of AA. Alcoholics Anonymous believes that it's a disease, and because it's a disease, you have to be absolutely abstinent. Because you have the disease, you cannot even drink lightly, because if you try to drink lightly when you have the disease, it will send you into full-blown binge and a bender kind of thing. Cognitive behavioral therapy was the original professionally run therapy. And nowadays, the therapists who do this use all kinds of different types of therapy, CBT, ACT, family systems, a variety of different things. And here the idea is training after, again, there's going to be the detox, but training individuals to understand how their alcohol behavior and drinking functioned in their lives, and then try to replace those functions with other types of things. Getting people exercising is an example of that. Unfortunately, a lot of people in recovery replace the drinking with cigarette smoking, and I wish that were not the case, because the cigarette smoking, you've created another problem, but that's very common, I can tell you. It's a very common in AA too, for people to take up smoking or smoke more heavily in recovery. And in some cases, the goal for life is to be able to engage in controlled drinking. And again, from a harm reduction approach, if you can get somebody to where they're just drinking socially, but drinking lightly without consequences, that's better than alcoholic drinking. This tends to be professionally run. There are people that do AA and they do professional treatment. And some of these individuals, the goal is controlled drinking. For other these individuals, it's to get sober and stay sober. But there's a little more of a choice offered down here. These individuals don't believe that it's a disease per se that has to be controlled with total abstinence. And these people too, like if you've been depressed once in your life, we don't consider you to be depressive. If you have recovered from your depression, it's more like once upon a time you had depression. So these individuals don't believe it's a disease. And so they will oftentimes after recovery say, you know, I used to have a drinking problem. I used to have an alcohol problem. These individuals, even if they've been sober for years, will identify themselves as an alcoholic. So it'd be like, my name's Denise. I'm an alcoholic. I've been sober for 10 years kind of thing. So that identity is a little more important in the AA model. Motivational enhancement therapy, we've talked about this a little bit more as motivational interviewing, or MI, in this class. And this is where individuals, it's like the opposite of confrontation. The treatment is ongoing, motivating them in a very gently, warm, empathic way to examine their drinking or their drug use, to try to cut back with the support of their therapist and family members, and then eventually quit and be sober, or engage in just light recreational social drinking. So these three approaches, and I'm curious, which do you think works better? Anybody have one that they feel like would work better? If it were you, if it were somebody that you knew closely, any opinions here?
AA.
Okay, I hear an AA.
CBT.
Okay. And
I'll go CBT too.
Okay, okay, we got a CBT vote. Yeah. And AA, the really nice thing about it is you can almost find meetings anywhere you go. So it's a lot more support than, say, the support that you might get from like a weekly or a bi-weekly meeting in CBT. Okay, let's talk about Project Match. So when I was down at MUSC, we were one of the arms of this research program. I didn't participate in this. This wasn't anything that I trained in. But what they've studied was outpatient treatment, and then they studied individuals who were inpatient. And there were different arms of this study all across the United States. So Charleston, South Carolina wasn't the only place where this was being studied, because they wanted to just study people from different regions, different cultures, and that type of thing. And they took these individuals who were either in outpatient treatment or discharged from inpatient, were now outpatient, and they randomly assigned them. And that's very important. So they either got assigned to AA, CBT, or the motivational interviewing arm. And what they found is, lo and behold, there was virtually no difference in the treatment outcome. So even though they were randomly assigned, some people got something they wouldn't have normally gone for. They all worked equally well. And so basically, when I think about treatment here, I think about getting help is the most important thing. Doesn't that make some sense? That acknowledging you've got a problem and going and getting help, that's what really that's what really helps people in recovery. And again, some individuals would want to go to AA because they want to be able to go to regular meetings. They feel like they're going to need that support on a regular basis. They like the 12 steps. It's like not overwhelming. It's like, I'm going to work them. Lots of social support with the sponsor, social support in the meetings. People who are already spiritual and religious, that's a good fit. Individuals who might want to work more with a professional who knows what she or he's doing might want to go and get an individual therapist. But basically, they all work equally well. And that's great. That's good to know. Okay. I'm going to switch gears here now. And I want to talk about what is the one behavior in our culture that creates the most premature illness, that's morbidity, and the most premature early death, that's mortality. What's the one drug? And we could be talking about opioids here, because that is certainly something that is killing people, particularly younger people. But what we're going to be talking about here is using tobacco use, cigarette smoking and vaping. Okay, it was way back in the 1930s, before any of us were even eggs, that scientists and physicians were discovering a link between cigarette smoking and problems in health. Prior to the pandemic, it was the #1 preventable cause of disease and death. And don't worry about these raw numbers. I'm not going to expect you to remember these raw numbers, but I want you to know that a lot of this illness and death is from firsthand smoking, but then there's also a lot of injury that occurs being exposed to secondhand smoke, other people smoking. It is in our culture, a huge social, political, economic issue. There is a tremendous amount of money spent on advertising because people tend to be very loyal to their brand. So if a cigarette company can advertise to you and get you in their market niche, you are likely going to be using their product for a long, long time. It is particularly an economic issue for us in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, because we are the tobacco belt. This is where most of the tobacco is grown in the United States. Philip Morris is a huge company. They have about 46% of the market share. In US culture, we do not have strong warning labels on cigarettes. I took a bunch of pictures when I was in Mexico because they have very strong labels. And so I've got some pictures of the Mexican cigarettes here. Smoking causes fatal lung cancer, as an example, very strong in your face labels. And we keep our labels kind of in the muck and the mire. And that is because of the power of the politics of the tobacco companies. We've got about 19% of US adults as cigarette smokers. We are seeing that data. I'm going to talk about vaping here in a little bit. We're seeing more people using tobacco products because of the vaping, though. In high schoolers, it's at an all-time low because the use of the e-cigarettes and the Juuls and the vaping is at an all-time high. So we're seeing less cigarette smoking and more vaping, and we're even seeing more people now vaping and addicted to nicotine who never would have been a cigarette smoker. Overall, in recent trends, we've seen more decreasing in men, more increasing in women. A lot of the increasing in women is direct targeting women, particularly things like the Virginia Slims campaign, particularly targeting women's vulnerability in their body image. And even Virginia Slims was not an accident. It was a very strategic word for encouraging women to smoke instead of eat, as well as smoking raises metabolism a little bit and decreases appetite a little bit, but telling women that they could be slim as well as enjoy the pleasure of cigarettes. We tend to see individuals of lower socioeconomic status smoking more. So people in blue and pink collar jobs tend to smoke more than middle class, upper class, more educated individuals who are working more in professional jobs. But again, we're seeing more of the middle upper class getting into the vaping, particularly at high school age and at college age. we got a whole new problem on the table nowadays. Costs are exorbitant. And let me just basically break this down. About 12% of our total health expenditures in the United States are spent on healthcare for smoking and tobacco use. And that is a huge proportion of the dollars that we're spending. Breaking that down a little bit more, I want you to know kind of in the breakdown, about half of those expenses are medical costs. And about half of those expenses are lost productivity when people are sick and they can't go to work, when people are hospitalized and they absolutely can't go to work, or they become disabled and they're absolutely not capable of working. That's so about half is lost productivity, about half is medical costs. Because of this, and I want us to kind of think about how public healthcare works. So Medicare pays for people 65 and older and people with a registered disability. Medicaid is the healthcare that we give to poor people based on state taxes. And so Medicaid varies by state, and it varies based on what each state considers to be below the poverty line. But because of this, excuse me, there were a lot of state politicians, when they were looking at their budgets and looking at how much money they were spending in their Medicaid funds to take care of people who were sick from smoking, as well as federal politicians who were taking a look at how many Medicare dollars they were spending to take care of people who were sick from smoking. This became a big political issue. And let me tell you a little bit about, we're going to get to John McCain here in the master settlement in a second, but I want you to absorb some of this advertising. So again, back to the label, the Mexican label here: smoking clogs the arteries and causes heart attacks and strokes, out there in your face. And let's take a look at what some of the advertising has been in the United States over time. Doctors were recommending that you smoke. Pregnant women were saying it's a great thing to smoke. Our former president, you all weren't born when Ronald Reagan was president, but he was an actor before he got into politics. And here's Ronald Reagan telling you to smoke. It's such an athletic thing to be an athlete and smoke. Virginia Slims made you believe that, which was crazy. Santa used to smoke. And then this is an example. You've come a long way, baby. The Virginia Slims campaign, again, targeted women's body image. Prior to the Virginia Slims campaign, the norm in US culture was men were allowed to enjoy cigarettes, but girlfriends and wives were not allowed to enjoy cigarettes. So another thing that the Virginia Slims campaign cleverly latched onto was the feminist movement. And so You've Come a Long Way, Baby is trying to say, you've come a long way socially. You deserve equality. You deserve to be able to enjoy cigarettes just like the guys get to. When I think back though on this Virginia Slims campaign, so they made her look really modern and really sassy and really attractive and really slender. The whole baby thing eats me alive. You've come a long way, baby. Like you're not a grown woman, you're a baby. That part really irritates me. I have issues, I know. Okay. So because of the politics and the expense, the tax-based dollars that we were expending to take care of people sick from smoking on Medicaid and Medicare, he's passed away, but former Senator John McCain, he was Republican, but John McCain was really good at bringing Republicans and Democrats together at negotiating really tough problems. And in 1998, he came to a master settlement with the states and the tobacco industry. But I want to tell you about what happened prior to this. So years before, Congress called the CEOs of the tobacco companies to Washington. They flew in their private jets because that's how rich they were. And in congressional testimony, they asked these owners of these tobacco companies, is nicotine addictive? And the answer was no, it's not addictive. It's a natural product. It comes from a plant. The second question they asked them, is there enough scientific evidence to suggest that cigarette smoking and dipping and that stuff causes harm? And the tobacco industry lied again. They said, no, you cannot do the true scientific find causality method to prove that cigarette smoking causes harm. The third thing they were asked, are you advertising and marketing to children? And they said, oh no, we would never want children to smoke cigarettes. But when you're an adult and you turn 18, you have every right as an adult to enjoy our products. So basically, now looking back, they got away with all that. They were released, okay? They got away with that. Basically, they were lying. They were lying about nicotine being addicted. They had chemists back at home who were manipulating the chemical in nicotine to make it more addictive. So if you tried their brand, the quicker you got addicted, the quicker you were using their product on a regular basis. They lied. Second, they lied. We had plenty of naturalistic research and animal model research to know definitively that cigarettes were causing disease and were causing premature death even back then. The marketing, no, we don't want children smoking. Part of the reason why in advertising they were using cartoons is they were running focus groups back at home showing that kids and teenagers paid more attention to an advertisement advertising cigarettes when there was a character on it like Joe Camel than when there was a human being on it. So they lied. So John McCain, fast forward into the future here, he created a settlement where the tobacco industry agreed to pay out $209 billion to the states to help them recover their Medicaid costs, to help supplement the funds to take care of these sick people. That was to be paid out over 25 years. And 46 of the states took this settlement. Four states did not. And I believe that was Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, maybe Georgia. In the states that chose not to do it, the states that relied in their economy on growing tobacco. The payback was the states that took the settlement, individual people could no longer sue in that state, sue directly the tobacco industry for the harm that the cigarettes did to them. So the trade-off was the tobacco industry had to pay out this money, but they could no longer, the laws changed in all those 46 states where individuals could no longer sue the tobacco industry. Questions here about master settlement agreement? Okay, don't worry about these raw numbers, but I want to break it down. How is it that cigarette smoking or secondhand smoking ends up creating harm, and what disease processes show up? We know that coronary heart disease, which is usually a heart attack and a fatal heart attack, is 6 times higher in smokers than non-smokers. We know that in terms of cancer deaths, the #1 type of cancer that kills in the United States is lung cancer for both men and women. But cigarette smoking can raises risk, lung cancer being the most popular, raises risk of oral cancer, esophageal cancer. It raises risk of breast cancer in women, as an example. It even raises risk of cancer in bladder. But basically, any organ in the body can be touched by the carcinogens in smoking, and it can spin out cancers in any part of the body, but lung cancer being the most. Cases of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, these are usually the people that are on oxygen tanks, where the lungs get so damaged they just cannot move enough oxygen into our circulatory system. I want you to know that about 35% of house fires get started from cigarettes. And a lot of people are getting burned, and a lot of people are dying from these house fires every year. And then I want to talk about secondhand smoke, and then the power of what we call vertical smoking. Vertical smoking would be when a mom smokes during her pregnancy, the damage that is done to her fetus and her future baby. We know that when women smoke during pregnancy, they are more likely to have infertility and have difficulty getting pregnant. If they get pregnant and they're a smoker, they're more likely to have a miscarriage in first, second, and third trimester of her pregnancy. She is more likely to have a stillborn, so a baby that is born dead. She is more likely, that baby, if it survives, is more likely to die of sudden infant death syndrome in the first year of life. That child is more likely to have a learning disability and ADHD, and that child is more likely to have chronic ear and throat infections. Now, all of those effects on a woman and her fetus and her child when she's a cigarette smoker, when she is not a cigarette smoker during her pregnancy, but she lives with a partner who is a cigarette smoker, then she's getting secondhand smoke, and then baby's getting vertical transmission. You see all of the same effects to a lesser extent: the miscarriage, the stillborns, the sudden infant death syndrome, the ADHD and learning disability. You see all of that to a lesser extent when she's a non-smoker, but she lives with a smoker. So this secondhand smoke stuff is really powerful too. Okay. More on what we know. So like in Mexico, smoking when pregnant harms your baby. It's just right out there. Naturally occurring in the tobacco smoke are 50 known chemical carcinogens, and carcinogens are chemicals that will alter DNA and can spin out cancer cells. So carcinogens are the chemicals that cause cancer. I don't expect you to know these. This is giving me chemistry class flashbacks that are unpleasant right now, even myself. But just know that there are 50 known chemical carcinogens. We've talked about the prenatal effects, really driving heart disease, which is #1 killer for men and women in the United States. That has been fluctuating a little bit in the pandemic when coronavirus moves up to #1 and then moves back down. Lots of lung cancer deaths. Sudden infant death in kids, the asthma the ear infections we've talked about, the asthma, the throat infections also. Any questions here?
I have a quick question.
Okay, go for it.
So if a child grows up in a household where smoking is present, how does it affect their development? Like, do they develop slower than healthy children?
Yeah, it creates for the learning disability and the ADHD, it creates some oxygen deprivation and carbon monoxide poisoning that is definitely going to affect brain development. Now, there's greater brain development in the first year of life than at any other time. You think about how big babies' heads are and how much they grow. And so being exposed in that first year of life is especially dangerous. But being around and smelling somebody else's smoke and breathing somebody else's smoke is going to continue to create some mild brain damage during development.
Thank you.
Yeah, I get real upset when I'm driving around and I see parents smoking in their car and they've got kids in the back. It's just like, oh.
My neighbor does that at home and it drives me insane. Like,
yeah.
I just want to tell her.
Probably I can understand why. Yeah, that's just not cool. To me, that's a form of child abuse. But yeah.
Is smoking like connected to childhood asthma where the child will eventually grow out of the asthma? Is that like, or is it like, I guess it's more of a medical question. I'll go and research.
Yeah. No, I don't know the answer to that. And I do know that some people, my kids included and me included, we grew out of our asthma. We had it as kids, and then it only sneaks back in as adults when we have a respiratory infection, which is part of my being terrified of getting COVID. All right, I'm off track here. Some people grow out of it and some people don't. Some people, it goes from childhood and it continues. I would think that being exposed to parents cigarette smoking does not help either one of those cases, but I don't know the data on it. Yeah, it's a good question.
Do you know if there are any psychological effects for children growing up in a household where either one or both parents were smoking?
I think watching their coping behavior could be one. You know, it's modeled like this is how you cope, particularly like if a parent's upset and then they go reach for a cigarette. So there's that piece to it. So there's both the chemical exposure, the smoke exposure, as well as kind of modeling coping behaviors. And then to add to that, you know, we just have to talk about alcohol. A lot of individuals smoke more heavily when they drink. And if you think about alcohol disinhibits, which is why people get loose, nicotine and stimulants inhibit, which is part of why we use stimulant medications to treat ADHD, because it's the inhibitory part of the brain that's not working well in ADHD. So it's no wonder that people tend to smoke more when they drink, and it's like they're going up and they're coming down all at the same time. You know, they're getting that inhibitory effect and the disinhibitory effect. And so those two things go together. If kids have seen that, you know, parents drinking heavily and smoking more heavily while they're drinking kind of thing, that's not going to be good in terms of modeling substance use. Yeah. What other psychological effects were you thinking? Was this Ruth?
Yeah, I didn't necessarily have anything specific in mind. I was mainly just thinking, like what you said about watching their coping behaviors, because with all my experience with babysitting and nannying, I've seen how easily kids can pick up on things from their parents just by watching them do it even one time.
Oh yeah. I mean, they're the most influential role models in a kid's life until, you know, you get into school and you've got teachers and whatnot. And we do know, I mean, I can tell you this data, that when you grow up in a home where both parents have smoked, you are a lot more likely to be a smoker than you've grown up in a home with one parent smoking. And if you've grown up in a home where nobody's smoking, you're a lot less likely to be a never smoker. And so some of that is socioeconomic status, some of that is modeling, but very powerful effects there. Yeah. Okay. So going back to the tobacco industry's argument, you don't have the true scientific experiment, so you can't say causality. The true scientific experiment, now we do this in animal models, so you can expose animals to different levels of cigarette smoking. You can look at all the disease process and the premature death in animal models, and that has been done. So you've got true scientific method with the animals. With the humans, what you would do is you would take, you know, hundreds of thousands of children, and you would randomly assign some of them to not smoke in the teen years, some of them to maybe be a pack of smoker in their teen years, some of them to be a 2-pack of smoker in their teen years, and you would track these children into adulthood and later on in life to where they got disease and they died. And then you would have the true scientific experiment, assuming you could randomly assign this stuff. Obviously, that's unethical. And why is that unethical?
Because we're exposing them to potential harm, and
yes, Philip. Yes, potential harm, and what I would say is known harm. You know, it's like, you know, it's not potential, it's known harm. Yeah, so you can't do that. Yeah, and for some reason, whoever was in Congress at that point in time there must not have been any scientists on the board, or they would have been like, wait a minute, you know, you can't do the true scientific experiment. So what I'm going to argue here is this is Bloom's taxonomy and criteria for causality. And if we meet all of these things in the scientific literature, we get closer and closer and closer to an accurate assumption of causality. Okay. And I know you all have had drilled in your head that a correlation doesn't give you causality, and that is true. But what I don't want you to do is say, by not doing the true scientific method, by doing, and I'm going to use the term naturalistic research. Don't confuse that with correlational research. With naturalistic research that meets all of these criteria, yes, you are very confident at an assumption of causality. Okay, so we're going to do this a little differently here. First of all, do you have biological plausibility? Is it plausible that use of this substance could translate into heart disease, cancers, etc.? And of the chemicals that we've talked about in tobacco smoke, there's over 4,000. 50 are known carcinogens. 50 are known to cause cancer. Okay. Add to that, there's this tar, this sticky solid that is naturally occurring in tobacco smoke. It's like creating cancer in a petri dish. You've got these carcinogens, you're inhaling them into the lungs. You've got this gluey, sticky substance that kind of glues the carcinogens to the lung tissue. Perfect petri dish creation of cancer. Nicotine, we know people would not use tobacco products if it weren't for the nicotine. It is a stimulant. It is highly addictive. Okay. Again, tobacco industry lied. Oh, no, nicotine's not, it's not a stimulant. It's not addictive. It's naturally occurring in a plant. Plants are good for you. Meanwhile, they had chemists. If you all have seen the movie with Russell Crowe playing the insider, it's a really good movie depicting what this poor chemist went through because he was a whistleblower. He was the first person to come forward and go, they're manipulating nicotine in their labs, making cigarettes more addictive. Okay. And then he was haunted. He lost his family. He had thugs after him, all this terrible stuff because the tobacco industry did not want that information leaked. Nicotine is a central nervous system stimulant and it's going to affect the neurotransmitter substances very quickly in the brain in a way that feels good in the brain. It's also the perfect mood drug. And when I say this, cigarette smokers oftentimes don't even know that they're doing this, but by the way that they puff, they can bring themselves up or they can bring themselves down by their puffing behavior. And their puffing behavior relates to, it's a different way that the nicotine arrives in the bloodstream and arrives in the brain. So when I think about somebody trying to calm down, you will oftentimes see it modeled in movie and TV where they take their cigarette if they're trying to calm down and it's just like, this really long drag. And that is going to be a steady stream of nicotine in the bloodstream that's going to affect the neurotransmitter substances in a way that helps them feel calmer. I think about Dennis Leary and the way he used to smoke during his stand-up. It would be like this puff, 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 make a joke, puff, 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 make a joke. In that situation, he was getting really stimulated. He was getting lots of energy out of the way that he was puffing that cigarette. And again, cigarette smokers, oftentimes they don't know that they're doing it. They've just learned that by their puffing behavior, they can energize or they can calm themselves down. So in some ways, it's a perfect mood drug in that regard. As a stimulant, it's going to be highly addictive. The more people smoke throughout the day, the more, you're going to have those opponent processes conditioned across time, and it's also going to promote cardiovascular disease. In cigarette smoke, naturally occurring is carbon monoxide. If hemoglobin, which is the molecule that carries oxygen around, O2 around in the body and drops the O2 off in the cells where it makes ATP and does whatever the cell needs to do, if hemoglobin has the opportunity to grab an O2 or grab a carbon monoxide in O1, it has an affinity for the carbon monoxide. And so when a person smokes, their hemoglobin is carrying around a lot of poisonous carbon monoxide, but the body's getting deprived of oxygen. So it's no wonder the cardiovascular system has to work overtime to try to get enough oxygen in the body. Think about a smoker's skin as an example. Smokers wrinkle and their skin ages much quicker than a person who's a non-smoker. And it's because their skin's simply not getting the oxygen it needs to be healthy. And then think about, thinking about exterior skin, think about internally all over the body, what is happening with that poor oxygenation in somebody who smokes cigarettes. Typical smoker is getting 8 times the carbon monoxide in their body every day that OSHA, which is the safety organization, would say is safe for the workplace. So they're getting a lot of carbon monoxide. Questions here about the biological plausibility of cardiovascular disease, cancer, other effects that you see in individuals who are smokers. It makes a lot of sense biologically. When we think about the beginnings of cigarette smoking and when people start and why they start, most individuals start because of peer influence. I got Beavis and Butthead down here with their smoking. If second to peers, it's siblings introduce a person to smoking. And again, that modeling by parents and guardians is pretty powerful also. But peer influence is the strongest, sibling after that, parental influence. And then the marketing influence. Again, Joe Camel deliberately trying to get teens to pick up their product because smokers are very loyal to their brand. We get over 1 million teens starting a year, 3,000 per day in the US. About 20% of teens are smoking somewhat by ages 13, 14. By the time they get to 4 cigarettes, so their 4th cigarette, by the time they get to the 4th cigarette, they're usually hooked. And one way of thinking about that, I had a crazy aunt when I stayed with her who eventually died of cancer because of smoking. She made me smoke a cigarette when I stayed with her because she was trying to teach me a lesson, and it was awful. And it taught me a lesson. I wasn't planning on smoking anyways, Aunt Joe. Anyways, and I haven't even told my parents my aunt did this to me. I choked my way through 1 cigarette, and it was aversive. And it was like, okay, I didn't want this, and I wasn't going to do it anyways, but I definitely don't want to do it now. But by the time you're motivated to get to 4, you're feeling the peer or the sibling influence, and then you've given yourself the opportunity to start getting the pleasure of the nicotine. Once a child, teen, young adult adopts a style, like how they hold the cigarette, once they've picked their brand, and once they've acquired an ashtray, by the time this happens, they're usually a smoker. Okay, so that's the start of it, the cause. The biopsych is very powerful here, you all. Nicotine is going to create that opponent process. Nicotine as a stimulant is going to lift the nervous system, lift the cardiovascular system. The opponent process is a downgrade of the cardiovascular system and the nervous system that builds up quite a tolerance. Nobody wakes up one day and says, let me be a 3-pack a day smoker. That builds up over time. It explains craving. Whatever environmental stimuli starts the opponent process, or it can be internal stimuli, feeling groggy, feeling stressed, feeling bored or lonely. The internal kind of emotional stuff can trigger the opponent process. And that is going to feel like craving. And then that person's going to reach out and try to get themselves a cigarette at that point in time. Withdrawal symptoms are going to feel uncomfortable and are going to feel physically stressful, emotionally stressful, are going to feel like anxiety. And you can end withdrawal by getting another cigarette. And there's a paradox that happens here when people say they smoke to relax or they smoke to calm down. That doesn't make sense when you think about nicotine being a stimulant. However, if you think about withdrawal syndrome is uncomfortable, anxiety, stressful, and you smoke and you end withdrawal, it's an illusion of calming down. Are there any questions on that? Again, nicotine wouldn't make sense as a calming drug unless you sort of knew the way they puff and the way that you know. But if using another cigarette ends withdrawal from nicotine, then it's an illusion that has calmed them down.
I have a question that kind of intertwines alcohol and nicotine. Do you know why when some people get intoxicated, they crave nicotine if they're not intoxicated where they wouldn't necessarily smoke or use tobacco products?
Yeah, it's that the alcohol is a depressant or a sedative, and the nicotine is a stimulant, which is again why when people drink more who smoke, they do more of both, right? But that would be if the alcohol has depressed their nervous system and it feels yucky, then you smoke the nicotine and it elevates and stimulates the nervous system. Does that make sense now?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. Any other questions? And then there's all that classical and operant conditioning that's happening. So classical conditioning to the time of day. If you smoke in your car, you get in your car, you want to light up your cigarette, being around certain people, certain emotions. There's all kinds of classical conditioning going on, which is why it's actually easier for people to get off of heroin than it is to get off of cigarette smoking or vaping. And part of that is not, heroin's more powerful than nicotine. nicotine, but it's because people have classically conditioned it to so many things throughout their day and night. People aren't shooting up heroin in the grocery store and while they're driving and when they're feeding their kids. They're only doing that in very circumscribed environments. And that's why it's a little bit easier to break those classically operantly conditioned bonds compared to nicotine. Now, I want to think about how powerful this is. And for those of you who are never smokers, I want you to have some empathy for how powerfully addictive this can be for somebody who is addicted to nicotine. It only takes 7 seconds after a puff for nicotine to get to the brain and operate on those neurotransmitter substances. And it's mainly dopamine, which is the reward NTS. And so it takes only 7 seconds for this to create primary reinforcement in the brain. Now, a 1 pack a day smoker, 73,000 cigarettes, it's 73,000 puffs a year. This is 73,000 learning trials. And remember, primary reinforcement's more powerful than secondary, tertiary, et cetera. 73,000 learning trials a year for a person smoking 1 pack a day. That would double in a 2 pack a day smoker. And it's, and for those of you, I want to think about other primary reinforcement. Like we don't satisfy hunger that many times a year. We don't satisfy even thirst that many times a year. I don't know how much sex you kiddos are having, but it's probably not 73,000 times a year, right? Of getting that primary physical reinforcement in the body. So this is incredibly powerful. And then the idea that it's getting paired with all kinds of other stuff, and then that all kinds of other stuff ends up triggering opponent process, triggers that craving, and then people light up again. Questions here?
Is 1 pack of cigarette the average for a smoker a day?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know. I would say most addicted smokers are probably smoking more than 1 pack a day. But I don't, that's a real, does anybody know? Anybody else in the class have any idea what the average is? Somebody Google it.
But it never got to a point where I was like, damn, 1 pack a day, 21 cigarettes sounds great.
Yeah, I'm looking into it.
A lot of college students, what's the word? They're chippers. And somebody talked about why they smoking with the heavy drinking. A lot of college students kind of chip cigarettes, or they only drink when they only smoke when they drink. And again, you college students are higher socioeconomic status than say low SES, more blue collar, pink collar, who smoke the most. If anybody finds what the average is, let me know.
It says from the CDC that it's declined from 17 cigarettes to 14 cigarettes between 2005 and 2016.
So about a half a pack is the typical user. Okay.
And that's specifically for daily smokers.
Daily smokers. Okay. I bet it's higher in lower SES and lower in higher SES.
What type of interventions could you use for people that are psychologically dependent on it?
We are headed there. Yeah, we will head there. Yeah.
I have a question about location. I feel like if you're farther away from where you get your nicotine or your cigarettes, wouldn't you just buy in bulk, and then if you have them, feel like you're going to smoke them quicker? Like if you know the gas station's right down the road and you limit yourself to 1 pack a day, do you think that would impact the amount you smoke versus if you live in a rural area and you buy by the carton? Do you think that has an effect, or like a?
You bet. We're gonna head there for treatment and interventions, but that's one of the things you have people do is distance and make it harder to access a cigarette. So yeah, let's do the vaping and then we'll head into the treatment. Vaping is increasing in popularity. 37% of 10th graders. It's more frequently used to using cigarettes 6+ months later. So the vaping causes the cigarette smoking. And the reason why that tends to be the case, people get hooked on the nicotine and then the vaping is just too expensive. So then moving over into the cigarettes, which are expensive, but cheaper than the vaping. In a review, they linked smoking cigarettes and those who would not have started with cigarettes. So though there are people who start vaping and get addicted and then end up smoking cigarettes who would never have been a cigarette smoker in the first place. There is some harm reduction compared to true cigarettes because they're bypassing around some of the carcinogens in the smoke, but then there's an added layer to the preservatives in the vaping that is particularly dangerous. And we are seeing in the pandemic, individuals who are smokers and vaping, when they get the virus, have a lot more damage, more likely to die than individuals that were not vaping. There's even passive vaping hazards. So when you walk down the sidewalk and somebody else spews out their vape exhalation and you're inhaling that, that is dangerous for you. And they're more likely to continue vaping than if people vape to try to stop smoking cigarettes. That is usually not at all successful. And then this is a dated death toll on the vaping, but we've got new problems on the block. Smoking cessation, most who do so, they do so on their own and without professional help. But most people make multiple attempts before they actually quit smoking. And so one reframe you're going to see in this documentary that I'm going to have you watch is that instead of saying, well, I tried to quit and I couldn't quit, I'm a failure, I'm going to continue to be a smoker, the way to reframe that as a professional, every time you make a quit attempt, what have you learned about yourself? And you're not a failure until you quit trying to stop smoking. Okay. But knowing the multiple quit attempts, 90% of smokers and vapors would like to quit, but they feel like they can't. And the can't really comes, this is why as professionals, we get in there and we explain the opponent process in terms that they can understand. The can't, so like I had an aunt who was a very heavy smoker. She ended up dying of this is a different aunt, different cancer consequences. She went cold turkey as a heavy smoker and went into horrific withdrawal. And she took the withdrawal as a message, oh, my body needs the cigarettes. Like, this is how bad it'll be forever if I quit smoking. And what she needed to know was the withdrawal syndrome is gnarly. First of all, she would have been better cutting back before she totally quit, but knowing withdrawal is temporary. She took it as a message of like, oh, my body really needs cigarettes. I can't quit. The success, we don't counsel people. We don't tell people this, but it's only 5% per attempt. And again, people who are getting off of heroin have more success with that than the 5%. We don't counsel people in this, but as a professional, when we're working with people, knowing this so that we don't get frustrated when they make an attempt and they go back to it, knowing that it's more of a long-term process to quit than a single event. Okay. Most who want to quit are doing.
Sorry. So that's a 5% chance that their attempt will be successful.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. Most want to for health reasons. There's a lot of social pressure nowadays. If you're around people who are non-smokers and you're a smoker, they are going to pressure you to quit. My dad, when I was little, I think I was about 8, 9, he quit on my birthday. And I think I was a budding health psychologist even as a little one because I nagged him apparently a lot. And so as a gift to me, he quit on my birthday. And so there's, little girl Denise was apparently nagging dad enough to help him quit. Saving money is very valuable for people. I've known college students, this is, if you need a side hustle, you all, I've known college students who hustle to New York. They buy cigarettes in North Carolina and they go to New York and sell them because the taxes in New York on cigarettes are so much higher than in the taxes on cigarettes in tobacco growing states. So there's students who've made money by doing that. Also motivating life insurance is way more expensive if you're a smoker, but even nowadays, a lot of health insurance companies will give you lower cost for your health insurance if you testify that you are a non-smoker. I do that every year when I renew my insurance. I testify that I've been a never smoker, except for that one my aunt made me smoke. And then I testify that my body weight is in a normal, healthy range, and I get a cheaper discount because of those two things on my state health plan. All right, this is what y'all are thirsty for, techniques. Acknowledging that there's both physical and psychological dependency because of the addictiveness of nicotine. And so when we do nicotine replacement, that raises the chances that a person is going to be able to quit. And when we do nicotine replacement, there are a couple of helpful things that are happening. Number one, we're giving them the physical satisfaction of the nicotine with nicotine replacement while they work on all the behavioral, psychological stuff and break the bonds, the classically conditioned and the operant conditioned bonds in their behavior. Second thing we're doing in nicotine replacement is you can control the dose. So most nicotine replacement, you start out on the replacement dose according to how many cigarettes you were smoking a day. But it's easier to control the tapering of the nicotine replacement dose and taper more steadily than with cigarettes. And what people do when they're cutting back on cigarettes and they don't even realize they're doing this is, let's say they were smoking 20 cigarettes a day and they've cut back to 10. When they were at 20 cigarettes a day, they were wasting nicotine. By the time they've cut down, let's say, and they've halved it and they're smoking 10, they're making love to those cigarettes. They are getting all the nicotine out of the cigarettes. And so they could be at 10 cigarettes a day, still getting the same amount of nicotine that they were getting with 20 cigarettes a day. So the nicotine replacement allows you to control that better, if that makes sense. And then breaking these bonds. I feel like there's a third thing with the nicotine replacement, but I'm blocking on it. So I'm going to move over here. Okay, behaviorally. There are some medically supervised therapies nowadays where they will have people do aversion therapy. And the most common form of aversion therapy is where you have people chain smoke, again, with medical supervision, chain smoke until they get sick. There's a great scene in the movie Sandlot where I think they use dip and then they get on a carnival ride and all the boys get sick. But overdosing on the nicotine in the smoke will make somebody physically sick. And you all probably have all had one trial learning where you got a stomach bug or food poisoning where you ate something and you got sick on it and then you never wanted it again. That's the aversion therapy. Hypnosis can be helpful, but it's not a miracle. And what we do in hypnosis is we put people under and then we make suggestions about their cigarette smoking habit. So one suggestion could be, I know you, when you're under hypnosis, I know you normally wake up and light up your first cigarette at 7 a.m. And actually, the sooner you light up after you wake up, the more addicted you are. Okay. So let's say in hypnosis, okay, tomorrow morning, you're going to wake up at 7 a.m. and you're going to be hungry and you're going to want your coffee and you're going to go make yourself breakfast. And you're going to be relatively surprised that you're just not craving a cigarette until later in the morning. So you've planted this suggestion, you've laid down a neural pathway in their mind that that's a possibility to wake up and surprise yourself that you're hungry, but you don't need a cigarette. And then you make all kinds of other suggestions there. I'm not going to talk about rest. I'm going to keep going because we're running out of time here. You want to break the classically conditioned bonds. So one way of doing that is using stimulus control. So I had a client at one point in time, a well-educated person who she even hid her smoking from her coworkers and started with stimulus control, would not allow herself to smoke inside her home, would first make herself go outside for any cigarettes that she wanted. She had to go outside. That was especially unpleasant in the winter. After she was going outside for all of her cigarettes, she was naturally cutting back. And then she came in and she said, I think I'm really ready to quit, but I need to up my game. My porch is too appealing right now. So I was like, okay, tell me a gross place involving your house. And she decided on her crawl space. So we've got a log cabin, we've got a deck, and then we've got a crawl space underneath her house. So that it would be that kind of thing. She said she had to go down under the crawl space where she gets down there and she's down there under the crawl space under her deck with the spider webs and everything. And she's allowed herself her cigarette because she's gone to the place where she set a rule where she was allowed to smoke. And she's down there in the crawl space and she's huddled over and there's spider webs and she's smoking her cigarette. And she's like, has this experience of like, oh my gosh, I'm an animal. I am a desperate animal. I am down here in this gross place just to get a cigarette. And after that, she was able to let him go. Another thing that we do to help people break classically conditioned bonds is delay techniques. And a delay technique, let's say you get people and you get them to commit, okay, I can have my cigarette, which is comforting. I can have my cigarette, but I've promised myself I'm going to delay X amount of time. So let's say somebody lights up in their car. So they get in, they light up, and then they go to wherever they go. And they decide, okay, I can have my cigarette, but I think I can commit to 5 minutes. So I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to drive for 5 minutes. If I still really want a cigarette, I will pull over, light up a cigarette after 5 minutes. They get to the 5 minutes, and then you get them to 10 minutes. And then you get them 10 minutes to 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And lo and behold, they've gone from home to work and they haven't had a cigarette at all. People like that because it's like, okay, I can have my cigarette. I've just got to delay. And the delay is changing the parameters. It's changing the ABCs, the antecedents, behavior, and consequence, the ABCs surrounding behavior. And it's breaking those classically conditioned bonds. And when you start breaking those classically conditioned bonds, you start breaking the opponent process. You start breaking up the addiction.
I have another quick question.
Okay, go for it.
So I'm curious as to how this would kind of translate, how some of these techniques would translate over to people that vape, because kind of how like my perception of vaping is kind of like having a continuous infinite cigarette on you.
Mm-hmm.
Because like it's just always so accessible.
Mm-hmm.
So like something like where she went outside and went into her crawl space and smoked a cigarette, how could that translate to someone that vapes, since you don't just like smoke one and you're done?
Well, you would do the same kind of thing with the stimulus control. You would get that person, if they're committed to cutting back and quitting vaping, they would need to do the same thing. They would need to stop making it so easily accessible.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And so the stimulus control is when you come up for rules, you come up with rules where it's allowed and where it's disallowed. Okay. But knowing you're breaking those, whether it's delay techniques, stimulus control, you're breaking classically conditioned bonds in doing that.
Wouldn't like the delay technique just reinforce them hyper focusing on the cigarette almost?
The comfort is they can still have their cigarette, but the therapeutic thing is they're changing the ABCs and the parameters, and therapeutically we know it's breaking the classically conditioned, operantly conditioned bonds. And the more you break those bonds, the easier it gets for people to cut back and quit. It is intense focus on the cigarettes for a while. I mean, yeah, you gotta pay attention to it if you're gonna cut back and quit though. Yeah. Effectiveness. Lots of people are using meds nowadays. Nicotine replacement. This used to be prescription only, and now it's over the counter. And it comes in all kinds of forms: patches, gum, inhaler, nasal spray. You can get lollipops apparently. This does increase the odds of success by 1.7. So it's not, again, nicotine replacement's not a miracle. Nothing is a miracle here. The prescription medications that are dopamine reuptake inhibitors or norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. As an example, Zyban is marketed for smoking cessation. It's the same thing as Wellbutrin, which is marketed for depression. This is used in a lot of attempts. One way of thinking about this feeds the neurotransmitter substances so that smoking on top of these meds is not nearly as rewarding. And then it's easier to cut back on the cigarettes or quit the cigarettes when the brain's getting the reward it needs without the nicotine. I do want to comment on Chantix. Chantix works differently than these meds up here. It blocks the reinforcing effect. So it goes into the receptors that get reward in the brain. So if you smoke on top of Chantix, you get nothing out of it. The good thing about Chantix is it's helped a lot of people quit smoking, because if you're not getting reward from the vaping or the smoking, then why bother? But where we've got to be careful, and where doctors really need to track their patients very carefully, is some people, if the medication locks into all the reward receptors in their brain, they're not getting any reward out of life. It's a formula for some people to fall into a very deep, dark depression. And we see some people get suicidal on it. So again, good doctors are not just, writing prescriptions saying, yeah, go quit smoking. They're following their clients and their patients very carefully. Behaviorally, we know what really helps is motivational interviewing. The clips that I'm going to load for you all to watch. Oh, wait a minute. Are we doing this in class? Let me see if I've got one more class period to cover this, or if I'm going to have you do this on your own. Oh, good. We've got next Tuesday to do this. And then you have an exam that needs to be taken by midnight next Wednesday. So I'll remind you all of that. Motivational interviewing, where you're really looking at their motivation to cut back or quit, and helping motivate them by adding other pros to their pro and con list. We're giving them all kinds of behavior modification techniques, the stimulus control. A lot of times early on, you have them self-monitor their cigarette smoking. In the old days, we did it on paper and pencil. Nowadays, you can have them monitor their smoking on certain apps. And that gives you the ABCs of their smoking behavior, the antecedents, the stimuli, the behavior, the consequences. Gives you all kinds of information of different behavior techniques. You do goal setting. All the stuff that we talked about in the behavior change lecture applies here. Social support, the main take home here is we know that individualized sessions and either face-to-face or Zoom or phone call sessions work better than, say, watching other people get a therapy. So getting personalized therapy, getting multiple sessions, because smoking cessation is not an event, it's a whole process, that can be advantageous. So regular sessions are better than one, and then using that stages of change, not assuming that everybody's in action. So tailoring the approach is going to be better than a non-tailored approach. Some public health things that have been effective, clean indoor air laws. When I came to Boone, there were no clean indoor air laws. There were people smoking in stores and restaurants, and there were people smoking in the academic buildings. Smith Wright had ashtrays in the hallway. We were inviting people to come in and smoke. And it was when I got pregnant with my second son, and I was sitting in my office in Smith Wright. Cigarette smoke was everywhere. I raised a big stink, as well did many of my colleagues who were sick of breathing the cigarette smoke in our building. We found out the university had a no policy about smoking policy, and actually the UNC system had a policy that said if you disallowed smoking in a public building, you had to allow 20% of the space for people to smoke. UNC law changed after that, thank goodness. We simply, in Smith Wright, we psychologists, we got rid of the ashtrays, and all of a sudden, students stopped smoking in our building. So we just got rid of the ashtrays. We created, students were smoking right outside the doorways and creating mulch fires. We were not calling the fire department originally, and we were going out and putting out the mulch fires. And then we got together as a faculty and we decided we were professors and psychologists. We were not firefighters. And every time a mulch fire started, we called the fire department, and that got very quickly, the university got very upset about that, because they had to pay the fire department to roll and put out the mulch fires. And then that allowed us to remove, there were ashtrays right outside the entrances to Smith Wright. That allowed the university was like, okay, we can take away the ashtrays, and then students stopped smoking right outside of our building. Restricting smoking to minors. When I was a little kid, you could go in any store, in any restaurant, and there were vending machines for cigarettes. Those were outlawed. Restricting the advertising. They are not allowed to advertise smoking on TV shows, and haven't for a long period of time. Many states disallow advertising on their roadways. Increasing the disincentive or the sin taxes. Everybody has a breaking point. If cigarettes get expensive enough, people will cut back and quit smoking. Again, like New York has huge sin taxes. California has huge sin taxes on cigarettes. Public education, the lawsuits, but we talked about the master settlement, and then funding research on how to help people quit. So best approaches, public health top down, individual counseling or group counseling top up, tend to be more successful. Okay, and on this note, we will watch these motivational interviewing counseling sessions together on Tuesday, and we'll talk about, they're going to model for you really unsuccessful counseling, and then they're going to model for you really successful counseling, and we'll go over that next class. Questions before we call it a day, you all? No? Okay. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and I will see you next week.
Yep,
Take care. Good questions today. Take care.